Welcome everyone to tonight's event. My name is Danielle Logston. I'm the Director of Volunteers for PMI Maine, and I will be serving as your moderator tonight. I think Benga and Stephen on our board owe me a drink after this, since this is PM happy hour. So with that, I will be taking us through tonight's event, kind of introducing our two guest speakers here and going over their bio. But before we, dive right into that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Joe, to cover our sponsors.
Yep, I'd like to thank our sponsors, USM, SMART, and ProSearch, and Bob Liberty and his organization for sponsoring us over the last couple of years. Without sponsors and volunteers, with our sponsors and volunteers, that adds significant value to the organization, so we can bring more events and opportunities to our membership across Maine. So a big thank you. And anybody that wants to volunteer or become a sponsor, please reach out to any of the board members, and we'd be very happy to have a discussion on how it can be mutually beneficial to our organizations. And I'll turn it back over to you if there's no other questions.
All right, thank you, Joe. I'm going to share my screen now. I think we'll go ahead before, again, we dive into the primary event tonight. Want to highlight our new members, as well as some folks that have recently achieved their PMP certification. And then would like to highlight our volunteer spotlight, somebody who is helpful and responsible for putting us in contact with our wonderful presenters tonight. So real quick, at a high overview, our current PMI Maine membership, we are at 455 members. So, a good number of members spread across the state. So very, very happy to have such a strong membership with PMI Maine. For the months of February and March, when I looked at our membership results, we have 26 new members. So I'm not going to take up the time to read through each name here, but we're always excited to see our membership continuing to grow, and 26 new members is quite impressive. So thank you to these folks for joining our chapter. Hopefully some of you are here tonight and find value in the membership events and programs like the one tonight from joining our chapter. I will read through the 5 members who have recently earned their PMP certifications. This is quite a feat, so definitely want to take some time to recognize Kevin Bryan, Elizabeth Shaw, Michael Sheridan, Luke Van Nolt, and then Jerry McClaley. Sorry, excuse me for mispronouncing your name there. But yes, huge congrats and shout out to these 5 folks. All right, and then I'd like to also highlight the spotlight, our volunteer spotlight for April and March and April, excuse me, is Brian Lindholm, PMP. So Brian is one of our program's volunteers, and Brian had taken action and reached out to actually Kim and Kate and asked if they would like to be a PMI Maine membership event speaker, and is responsible for putting our chapter in contact with these 2 great podcast hosts and project management experts. So Brian is our spotlight volunteer of the month. So Brian has been a PMI Maine member since April of 2017. He's currently an IT project manager where he developed and now runs the project management department and works with 5 technical departments on a daily basis. Brian moved to Maine about 2 years ago from Colorado, which I think we have a lot of our members who have kind of followed that same path and moving to the great state of Maine during the pandemic. So in his spare time, Brian likes to play and compose music, and he also loves spending time outdoors, hiking, playing sports, or just enjoying the fresh air while sipping on a cup of coffee. So Brian, huge shout out to you. Thank you for all the work you do for our chapter and as a programs volunteer. And if you're interested in getting involved in our programs committee, you want to be a spotlight volunteer at a future meeting, or just looking for volunteer opportunities with our chapter, please feel free to reach out to myself, Danielle Logston, the Director of Volunteers, or any one of our great board members. You can find our contact information on the PMI Maine website. All right. So without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our event for tonight. Our event is with PM Happy Hour, Kim Essendrup and Kate Anderson. And they are going to be walking us through how to be the wolf taking over broken projects. Kim is a PMP certified project manager. He recently completed a TEDx talk, and also is a PMI authorized training partner with over 20 years of experience managing projects, programs, and PMOs resulting in emotional trauma. He's the CEO and co-founder of raidlog.com and a partner at the PPM consulting firm Colme Group. He also has an unnatural fascination with project management tools. And if you want to nerd out about PMs, being a PM sometime, you can connect with him on LinkedIn. Kate Anderson is an information security professional who is a recovering project manager. Having spent 15 years in tech driving difficult projects to closure, their current focus is in the NA space. They live in San Diego with their wife, dog, and snake. Kate can be found on LinkedIn here for professional inquiry, and you can also discuss your latest shenanigans with her or with them. They're open to that. All right, so I will stop sharing my screen now and go ahead and turn it over to you, Kim.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. We're really excited to be here. Can you see my screen okay?
You can, yes.
All right. Well, Kate, shall we get started? Kate, can you hear me? Is Kate moving? Do we have difficulties? Technical difficulties? Well, Kate might have some technical difficulties, but while we're waiting to sort that one out, I'll jump in and start talking about it. So Kate and I have been doing our podcast since about 2017, and we love to do it. We love to engage with our listeners. And our approach is we like to really talk about the scary stuff, the tough stuff in project management, the stuff that doesn't always have a nice answer necessarily. Those are the kind of things you talk about with friends over coffee and try to figure them out. And that's what we like to try to focus on. And I think Kate's back. Kate, are you back? Hi, Kate.
Testing.
There we go. We're back.
Right.
Okay. I did have problems with this today. So if it happens like a couple more times, I'm just going to give up. Just to spare everybody the constant, like, are you there? So, but no, in my heart, I'm here, even if my internet just decides to give out.
Understand.
All right. So I just shared a little bit about project management happy hour. So shall we proceed?
Let us proceed.
Let's proceed. So today we're going to talk about being the wolf. But before we go there, let's talk about how many of you have been asked to lead a messed up, disaster, failing project. And that can be projects with delayed deliverables, unclear scope, never-ending expensive contracts, hemorrhaging money, no end in sight. Kate, what am I missing?
I don't know, like a boss comes up to you and says, I've got a special project for you. You know that doesn't mean something good.
Yeah, I think I just got voluntold for one of those last September.
There you go.
Exactly.
And, it's one, project management is challenging, right? And so it's, you can expect to have problems, but there's a whole nother category when a project goes off the rails. And we very often find ourselves, when you get to a certain point of your career, becoming what we'll call the wolf. And if anybody's watched Pulp Fiction and maybe knows what I'm talking about, it's the person that gets called in when everything goes wrong. A project is going to be a complete and utter disaster, and you need to call in somebody who's going to help you out. Did I miss anything there, Kate?
Mm-mm. It's a career achievement to become the problem solver. So in a way, you're honored if your boss is like, I got a job for you. You're like, don't, oh no. It's both a devastating and joyful moment at the same time.
It is. And when you find yourself in this position, you'll know it because you keep getting the broken projects, the ugly ones, the scary ones, the ones that don't seem set up for success. But it's not that they don't like you, is it, Kate?
No, they love you. That's the thing. They're so grateful they have somebody they can count on in a really difficult, stressful situation.
Exactly. So you're brought in to be the cleaner, the one to sort things out. So it's hard, but it's actually a good sign that your organization really has another level of trust for you to come in and sort things out. Shall we talk about the call?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So very often when you get the call to be the wolf, it's really, I've got a project, it's broken, I need you to come and fix it, or something to that effect. Is that what you've experienced, Kate?
My first, it was early in my career when this happened, but one of my bosses was like, I got a project and it's stuck. Like, this contract's bleeding money, but I think you could fix it. And I was like, why? What makes you think I could do that? And then sure enough, within like 6 weeks, I, through all of my digging, got the, I almost said enemy team because I played some video games this weekend, but I guess it's the company I was working with. I got our contract partners to essentially admit like, oh yeah, that the scope would just be X. And I was like, well, we've already done X, so we're done now, aren't we? And I got that in writing and documented. But it was, it was a gruesome 6 weeks before I got there. But in the beginning, it's so innocuous. Like, I bet you could figure this out. I was like, okay.
I think my biggest call was my boss called me in and said, look, I've got this project. It's one of our biggest projects with a very large utility. So it's a very strategic project. It's very high profile. It's going so wrong that I'm afraid we're going to lose millions of dollars on it. And we're taking the project manager out of it as of Friday, and he knows it, and you need to be there on Monday. And that's all I knew about it. So it was really, no idea what I'm walking into, other than I know it's a really, really bad situation. And my organization now is asking me to sort out this thing that could, spell financial ruin for the quarter or maybe even the year. It was going so poorly.
Yeah. So the call usually can either sound innocuous, like, hey, I bet you could fix this, or it sounds like everything is so bad and it's only going to be worse. So can you go now? That's what the call sounds like.
Yeah. So there's not necessarily going to be a bat signal that says, warning, this is going to be a disaster. Be ready. It could sneak up on you. So just be ready when you go in to really assess the situation and understand what you're getting yourself into. And a couple things about being the wolf going in is, it's important that when you walk in, that you really, not just failing projects, but anytime, of course, really be conscious of the fact that when you enter the situation, or physically enter it, or start getting on Zoom, or start talking with people and interacting with them, people that are involved in the project, that you're being measured from the beginning. They're learning what to expect from you. So one of the tips that we would have is when you walk in, create confidence by being confident in what you're doing. Don't be cocky, but don't come in sheepishly or feeling like, look like you're playing the victim when you come into the situation, but come in with some gravitas and some confidence that, yeah, you can figure it out.
Yeah. And I think that the reality of this is that it's hard every time, right?
Right.
No matter how many times you come into a project that really needs the ship to be righted, even if you're great at it, it's still hard. So you're not alone in experiencing the like absolutely gruesome, like core inducing, like guttural groan of trying to pull something back on course. But I think that's a helpful mentality to keep in mind. Like, I'm coming in to help something that is already messed up and it wasn't me who did it. And I don't even know if this can succeed. So part of me, one thing I have learned now in my career is part of that gravitas for me is acknowledging that, like accepting that truth. Not saying it has to be the reality of the project, but understanding that, hey, it's okay. However this turns out, I know I can do my best while I'm here. So let's get in here and do 10,000 project basic crunches while we try to get this project back on track.
Yeah. And there is something to be said about separation, personal separation. I know for me, I always identified myself as being someone who could get my project and make it successful. And so I was always very vested in it personally, which I think, helps me be a good project manager. And I think that helps most people. But when you come into a situation that's already on the skids, you do have to be careful about separation, in that you're coming into a situation where it's already broken. And so you shouldn't feel like this is all your fault going in, that suddenly you have to carry the world on your shoulders. You're coming in as a professional to help see if it can be sorted. And you've also got to keep in mind as you go through that process, the reality that not all projects should be saved. And so you have to be careful about how you say that. And when you say it, if you, and when that time comes, which we'll talk about in a bit, but go in knowing that, you can't do this all by yourself. You're a professional brought in to help the organization determine what it can do with what's left of the project. And, even if that's throw it into the bin. Yeah.
And I think one last important mindset to have is to avoid assumptions going in. Some people might say this is so easy to fix. You could just spend a week here and then everybody be right. Or you just need a project charter and everything will work out, or whatever it is, right? There's always going to be people talking. There's going to be people that say, oh, this is Sarah's fault from accounting. She didn't approve the procurement order. And if she just did her job, everything would be fine. And like all those things are interesting data points, but it's just information. None of it should be heralded as gospel. And so just go in without assumptions on what's going to happen. If you sort of take this attitude in of like, all right, I'm here to observe, learn, identify patterns, and help people who supposedly want to be helped out of this, even if they're going to hate it.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little some strategies to take when you go in. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important for you to come in and be calm, have a sense of urgency, but it's really interesting that the way people will mirror your responses, they'll mirror you and your ethos. If you come in and you're panicked and you're screaming and you're being very emotional, then people are more likely to mirror that. But if you come in, you have some self-control, you're cool about it, you understand and appreciate the urgency and treat it with urgency, but still you're going to have the cool head, you're going to be in a much better position because you're more likely to have people mirror that behavior.
Yeah. It's the difference between, I got to have all this documentation and I can't believe you didn't get anything set up for me, and versus something where it's like, hey, I'm expecting to be able to deliver an update by Friday, and your records on the procurement that we needed to achieve to meet these deadlines is an important piece of that. And I'm just trying to help understand, overall how things have gone. Can you help me get that done? Can you get this to me by Wednesday? That type of conversational tone where it sort of takes the pressure off is very powerful in situations like this.
Yeah. And, going along with this is and I think we'll talk more about this later, is still want to be respectful going in. You may go in and somebody might say, oh my gosh, this person has done such a terrible job. They're awful. They're ridiculous. They're incompetent. And that's why we have to save this. Take it with a grain of salt. There's always two sides, and you can't make a judgment call until you've heard both sides. And you're probably not going to hear that before you really engage with the team. Going back to my big recovery project, I had to go in. I went in, I was supposed to go on Monday, and I knew the project manager was on site on Friday. So I thought, well, I'll go in and say hi. So I went into the customer site. I let him know I was on my way and just going to say hi and get introduced to everybody. And I walked into the conference room, and it was 3 people, the project manager and 2 of his other project managers. And they had projected on the board a project plan, and it had over 1,500 lines in the project plan. And I thought, wow, that's a big plan. And I said, just got introduced, and I said, no, go ahead and do your thing. I'll just kind of observe and maybe ask questions. And they were going through and they were building the plan. They were setting durations, they were setting dependencies, they were doing all this stuff. And after a while, I said, well, how do you know how long that technical task is going to take? Because I'm looking around and it's just 3 project managers. And they said, oh, no, we know. I said, well, have you talked to the technical team about this? I said, no, we don't need to. We know this is how long it's going to take. And I thought, this is why I'll be here on Monday. And I also resolved that on Tuesday, that plan was probably going to go into the bin and we were going to start over. So, I was asked questions. Maybe they had a good plan, maybe they didn't, but I certainly wasn't going to assume that it was good, and just ask probing questions to see what I was getting myself into. And then there's this idea of being the doctor. Kate, can you share a little bit about that approach?
Yeah. You're trying to listen and provide a plan forward. You're not the person that even necessarily has to manage that implemented plan, right? You're trying to, with your experience and your typically outside eye, like understand what's missing and what potential solves could be. So you don't have to take on the burden of the world on your shoulders to identify the world's most perfect plan that's going to solve for every single, contingency that we could think of. Typically, and we're going to talk about these in a minute, there's a couple easy to spot areas where things are missing. And what you want to do is try to provide those as clearly as possible without needing to resort to feeling like, oh gosh, I have to do it all, or like it's my responsibility to take this on now. You're coming in with that outside eye, and that's valuable to be able to point out those things. So you're not the patient. You don't gotta solve it. You don't have to sit with the treatment for forever. You do need to identify where things are broken, and then we can talk about who would manage or own that resolution.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So you're going to go in and you're going to listen and you're going to try to understand what the problem is. And you're going to create, like a doctor, you're going to create a treatment plan. You're going to say, okay, if you want this to succeed, this is what you're going to have to do. And this is what it's going to cost you. And if you want to kill the project, this is what the impact is. And this is what it's going to cost you. It's not on you to make that decision to take the medicine. It's not on you to you pay that bill, that go and get surgery. It's your stakeholders, your sponsors, and you're giving them advice. It's on them to make the right decision about whether or not they accept the treatment that you give them. All right. So we talk about, now let's jump ahead. So we're coming into the situation, and now let's talk a little bit about what the problems usually are, not always, but maybe some things to look out for.
I think that what I think that the crux of all these problems is ambiguity. At one point, whenever it was like fun to make your own job description, I was like, I want to be ambiguity crusher. Like that's what I want my job description, my job title to be, because I love crushing ambiguity. I do not fear it. I relish it. It's my favorite thing. So it's why I like going in and fixing broken projects. I'm like, I will find what is broken and I will write it out clearly, and we'll make a new plan, and the new plan will be better and everything will be great. So it's not about, it's all of this is about you finding where that ambiguity is and ending it, clearly calling out what is missing, clearly identifying next steps forward, clearly identifying the gaps. You're about crushing ambiguity. You want to create clarity because clarity creates confidence, and confidence breeds action.
Yeah, if there was perfect clarity on everything, including the problems, they would have seen it and probably sorted out before they pulled you in. So a lot of what you do really is that. Some examples are, so one of them that always comes to mind for me are unclear project requirements, where it's just really not clear. What are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to deliver? What's it supposed to look like? And then when it comes, you're starting to build, you're starting to deliver there, that's when you realize there's the big disconnect.
I mean, that feels like it's 80%, right? 80% of all these issues is there was something written down that was not clear. And then maybe a different team went to implement it, or that went.
Oh, we lost Kate again. All right, maybe Kate will come back here. So while Kate's trying to come back, another example that I ran into was I actually got I was running a PMO in Europe. I was living in US at the time, and I got called on a Friday. And if you guys know, if you get a phone call about your project on a Friday afternoon, it's never a good call. Mm-hmm. So I got a phone call, and on Friday afternoon UK time, and then by Monday I was in the UK. So my weekend was blown because a project had gone completely off the rails so badly that the customer sent a legal letter saying that not only were they going to cancel the project, they were going to fine us several tens of thousands of pounds for the trouble that we had put them through. And so, long story short, after a lot of investigation and trying to figure out how to fix it, the problem in all this was ambiguity around dependencies. So my project team that we had out there, they were expecting the customer to deliver all these prerequisites for all the work they need to do. The customer had no idea that they had to do these things, why they had to do them, when they had to do them, or even really what they were. And so the project team wasn't able to do our job. And the customer says, I'm paying you to do the job. Why aren't you doing the job? And so this kind of went back around and around in the circle. And it took pulling everybody into a conference room to walk through the problems to really identify that this was the issue, and then to map all of that back to what the source of the problem was. Another example, the other project I started telling you about where I had to show up on Monday locally, our 1,500 line project plan. As great as the 1,500 line project plan was in obstructing progress, it turns out the real problem was ambiguity around expectations of the whole project, because the entire project had changed sponsors. A whole different department had said, wait a minute, the call center shouldn't own this project. IT should own this project, after the deal was signed and we were already 25% of the way through. And so now IT owns the project, and IT starts asking for all these things and having all these expectations that weren't in the scope. They weren't part of the deliverables. But the project team at the time was told, well, just maintain momentum, just keep going, instead of stopping and reassessing where they were at and realigning expectations and clearing up the ambiguity about what we were supposed to do. All right. So I'm going to continue on here in hopes that Kate can join. If not, well, you're stuck with me. I got you. So let's talk about what do you do? What are some things that you do when you get into the situation? And we talked about the fact that you've got to keep a cool head. You've got to be the one that's in charge and have some gravitas when you get in. And we talked about the fact that a lot of the problem is probably around ambiguity in some way, shape, or form. But what do you actually do when you get in? So a few tips here, just based on our hard-earned experiences. Really, first, identify who's in charge. And that sounds easy, but it's really not necessarily that easy. We've got to identify whose project is this. And really, as part of that conversation, is understanding who are all the people who have something to gain from the success of this project, and who are all the people that have something to lose from the failure of this project. Because those two stakeholders, those two parties, are the two that are going to give you the most aid and the most support. They have the most writing on this project. They're the ones you should be working with most of all to get realigned. And as a doctor, project doctor, they're the ones you have to give your diagnosis to, and they need to help. They need to make those hard decisions on if they're going to continue to invest in the project, change the project, or shut it down altogether. Part of this diagnostic, I don't know if you listened to our podcast at all, Project Management Happy Hour, but our first five episodes, we covered what we think are the first 5 questions that you should ask in any project. And they're pretty basic, fundamental questions. And I'll go through those here in a second. But you want to go back to the basics. Don't assume that if you're taking over a project, you're going to look at this charter and it's going to tell you what you need to know. Don't assume that everybody has a clear understanding of what the project's supposed to do. Really back up what you did this whole process. I'm going to back up and say, all right, let's start this project almost over. Whose project is this? What are they going to gain from it? And we ask our 5 questions, which are, Kate, quick question, quiz. First of all is, what's the definition of success, right? If this project is going to succeed, what does that look like? And not just what does it look like, but whose success is that? What do they get? So we've kind of touched on that first point. The second part is, what's the scope? What are we doing? But then you need to go a little deeper and say, okay, so that's the scope of the project, but what is the problem or the opportunity that we're trying to solve with that scope? And is that still at this stage in the game, is this scope or the product still the best way and the right way to solve that problem or take advantage of that opportunity? So that's question number 2. Question number 3 is budget. What's the cost? What's the budget? What's this thing costing us? What's our investment? And not just what's that investment, but what is the value that that the organization is expecting in return for that investment? There's financial investment. There are human resource investment in this project, maybe even some credibility. There's a lot of things that an organization will invest in a project, and that's being done with an expectation of some value in return, which can be quantifiable, like a hard return on investment, or a soft return, maybe customer satisfaction or something like that. Next, we go on to schedule, which is what's the timeline we need this in? Are there any deadlines? And are the deadlines hard? If so, what's driving that? But also ask if those timelines are arbitrary. Executives, we all know, they'll often say, well, I want this by the end of Q1. Why? Because I want it by the end of Q1. And we're failing if we don't get it by the end of Q1. And you've got to ask the question, well, what if we don't get it all by Q1? What if we get part of it by the end of Q1? Would you be willing to pay double to make sure it still gets done in Q1? Or were you willing to save some money and go a little bit into Q2 or 3? So really ask about that. And question number 5 is, what can go wrong? Where can this thing go off the rails? Now, obviously at this stage, this particular project may be well off the rails, but there's no rock bottom. There's always a worse and the lower bottom. So ask the question, as bad as this is getting, where could it get even worse for us? And have that dialogue, and then try to determine what you're going to do there. Kate, and are you there? Anything to add to that?
Testing.
You have successfully tested.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat. I know we love to answer questions as we go.
Me too. Yeah.
So if you lose me, you know where to find your question. So what if you may not completely trust your company culture not to blame you if the project fails, like despite your best efforts? Like, what if you're the doctor, but you want to avoid being sued for malpractice?
That is a great question. You're familiar with a RAID log? We won't spend too much time going through that today, but so RAID log is basically your risk register, your issue register, your decision register, and maybe your change log or action items, things like that, all put into one document.
Right.
My advice to, especially going into a failed project, and I mean this literally, if it's a failing project that's related to government, treat your RAID log like it's subject to subpoena, because one day it may be. And that is very, very true, very literal. So when I would start documenting the paper trail, you write up your diagnosis, write up the risk, write up the issues, and publicize them. Make sure everybody sees them and knows that you're bringing this stuff to light. They're not your issues. And if you're doing that like a doctor, you're bringing those things to light. You're trying to help your stakeholders solve their problems, because this is honestly their project. It's their problem. You're trying to help them solve it.
Right.
There's still some risks. Some organizations, they don't care and you're still going to throw you out. But then at that point, I guess as a project manager, you need to decide if you still want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also add that I'd look for a champion for you in this, right? Especially on internal projects, politics play a really big role. So whose job is on the line if you don't succeed, whose job is on the line if you do succeed, right? Looking for who your like political allies are is something it took me 15 years to really figure out well. And you'll find that not through like standard project status meetings, you'll find that through building those relationships with those peers in your network. So you'll want to understand like what their overall roadmaps are, how this failing project contributes, whose P&L it's on, and what the impacts are to that particular person if this doesn't succeed, or if it does, right? Or how badly is it bleeding money and who's going to get blamed? It very well could be that they're looking for a scapegoat, and then you'll want to partner with that champion to be like, how do we scapegoat it? Right? Because even within that, like that's sort of a reality of work sometimes.
Right.
So I would definitely look for your champion in that. Hopefully you have a manager that you can trust, that you can work with on that. But if not, I would go to your trusted peers, who are maybe a level or two above you, who can help champion you forward as you navigate that. Always ask for feedback on your approach. I think, see what they think about it, not about your prescription, but about like how it's being received and like what's going on across the company.
Yeah, I really like how what you're saying there, Kate, about making sure you're aligned with the sponsors and the sponsors involved, in particular executive sponsors. And it's so important to build those relationships and build that dialogue of trust with them, because that's what can turn the project around. And if they know that you're there to try to save their project, then hopefully you can get them on board. I was recently coaching one of our PM Happy Hour members, and their situation was that they have a project that's really in the rocks right now. And unfortunately, her direct manager is part of the problem. He's very emotionally and prone to outbursts and causing a lot of problems. And she's afraid that he will turn her into a scapegoat. And so after our discussion, she's actually working very hard more to align herself with the executive sponsors on that particular project, because that's really the right thing to do. And, in this case, with this project, they're going to have more sway over things.
Yeah. And then there's one more follow-up here. Let's say you've been nominated as the wolf, but it's been 6 months and the project is still not on course despite your best efforts. How do you distance yourself? As you said, you're the doctor, but you're not responsible for taking the medicine. And I'll take a quick stab at that. I think this is an extension of the conversation we're having right now, which is around understanding the politics of what's going on with your project, right? If there's somebody they're like, it happens in business where they're like, yeah, let's make this VP fail so that they're, forced to step down. And if you are able to identify that that's what's happening, you just keep documenting, and aligning with folks that are maybe not part of that org. That's politics I honestly never thought I would play in my career. And it's not something I've ever really done, but I've seen it play out with my peers at a couple different organizations. Like Kim was literally just talking about one of our PM Happy Hour members needing to align with the executive sponsors. I will say having a mentor within your company is a big way that you can make sure that you can find ways to get out of this. So if you have that person who's a skip level above you, you can have this conversation with them and they...
Oh, there we go.
No, I'm here.
Oh, there you go. Hey, all right.
Okay. But that mentor may be able to point out those people who you could work with to help distance yourself. So really these things are around your network, right? About how to leverage that network that you have to get feedback, and where you can ask them questions like, what do you think's going on? Like, why do you think this isn't successful? You're doing a good job. Learn about like almost the meta information about your project.
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Excellent. This really is a wonderful scenario that you get put into a position to fix a failing project, and then it doesn't go as well as people hope to do. You brought up a really wonderful point of having a mentor. One of the other things I found too is upfront is finding somebody that's in very senior leadership that understands that this could possibly go sideways, and that becomes your partner / mentor to give advice that if, through the best efforts of what happened prior to you taking on or being asked to take on this role, you take, I call the happy path, where things work well. But then you also, one of my models is plan for the worst and hope for the best. And then, but you start right from the beginning, from, planning from the worst and hoping for the best, working with that nth level of management, depending how big the project, program, or portfolio that you're managing is, getting that to the highest level of leadership and having understand these are different directions that you're taking. Does that make sense, or can you elaborate on that, please?
I think being in a position where you're the wolf and you're remediating projects, that going through that is painful and it's difficult, but it will give you the equivalent of a doctorate in stakeholder management. It's a hard way to do it, but you're right. It's all about learning how to integrate with the organization and those stakeholders.
Yeah, I think it's powerful to get that plan circulated, because then you're talking about buy-in, right? And if you're able to identify, who's influencers on your stakeholders. We did an episode with Sheila called Directing in the Boardroom, where she talks about how like so little of what she does is actually in the boardroom. It's like months and months leading up to like these big conversations between very powerful people within her community, like directing big decisions that she's managing. And so totally, absolutely circulate that plan, and both circulate it one-on-one without a big audience, and then work towards the plan that everybody is bought into in front of a big audience together. It's a tricky business.
I understand. That's great advice. And part of what you brought up was, the create clarity, and creates action, and, and creates a positive outcome for what you're working on. So that's something that should be thought. I'm just throwing it out there as a question for the experts, which you heard the experts getting back to us. That should be thought of right up front, right? Well, what are the possibilities of this thing going south, and how do we put in early on mitigation practices which aren't perceived negative and politically negative going forward, to ensure that when these things do come up, with large projects do come up, and moving forward. So I just kind of want to throw that out there and get thoughts.
Yeah, I think on a project where you have the luxury of things not being like hemorrhaging money or time or people, it's definitely great to have those conversations up front. There's a whole, I think, rigor we can go through there. It's just that's that just people just don't think those things are important until you're bleeding money.
Yeah.
Which is why we end up in these scenarios. But I think Kim here, I think we can keep going through those questions, because I feel like that helps create that clarity here. Because what we're doing is, in order for us to get back to that rigor, those regular project rhythms, first we have to identify what is wrong. So take us through it, Kim.
Oh, yeah. So just kind of continuing on, another thing that you'll do as you're trying to understand the situation and do through diagnosis is, of course, you need to spend some time going through the documentation. And oftentimes there'll be some good documentation. You'll be able to see maybe some charters, some plans, some schedules, maybe even some RAID logs or risk logs. All too often that's pretty lean or pretty light, or it's wrong. So when you're going through this documentation, charters, things like that, read it and understand as much as you can about the history of the project and where it came from, but don't trust it and expect that if your project is kind of hitting the skids, you're going to have to basically go back and probably revalidate the scope, revalidate everything that you're doing. So yeah, I guess that's what I have to say about that. Do your research, but don't trust what you find.
Excellent advice. Thank you.
And through this process, we need to build trust, because if you're in a project failure situation, they have to call in the wolf to fix things. It's because things are going terribly wrong, and there's some broken trust somewhere, whether it's between the leader and the team members between themselves, between the team and stakeholders. And so part of your job, something you need to start trying to do very, very early on, at least for yourself. Later on, it'll follow for the project, but you have to start rebuilding trust. Kate, thoughts on this?
Oh, but Kim, this is so your topic.
I know.
Kim's TED Talk was on trust bricks. So I think what I could speak to, since Kim's our resident trust expert, is just how hard it is to come into an environment where people think that you're there to throw them under the bus. And so part of the reason we talked about coming in with that confident, unassuming attitude in the beginning is, if you're going to go talk to Sarah from accounting and procurement, and you believe that she's the problem, she's not going to help you. And Sarah might be one of your biggest allies in solving this problem. So as you approach the people that you're working with, your goal is to communicate that you'd like to help them succeed, that your goal is pretty neutral, just to try to get the project on track. And then that what you want is for success for everyone as part of this. And do you want to take us through, Kim, what trust bricks are and how you can build those with those folks?
I will. I'll talk a little bit about it. So I did I did a TEDx talk on this topic in February, and you can find that talk on the YouTube channel for TED or trustbricks.com. It doesn't quite point to where the final recording is, but it'll get you there eventually. And so the idea of trust bricks really came from having to resolve a lot of broken projects, and how do you do that? And one way to think about trust is your relationship with another person is like a bridge, right? Made out of bricks. If you build that bridge with a whole bunch of small interlocking bricks, then your bridge is strong. Even if a couple bricks break, there's still enough bricks there to hold that bridge together and give it support. But if you try to build a bridge with just one or two big pieces of stone, with just one of those pieces of stone breaks, the whole bridge is going. And your relationships are the same way. If I go into a sponsor of a broken project and say, hey, I want you to trust me, I got this under control, and walk away, they're not going to trust you. You've given them no context, no framework from which to judge if you're trustworthy. And so, of course, they're not going to trust you. Instead, use small trust bricks, small interpersonal interactions where you set and meet expectations over and over. Don't miss a single one. So if you say, look, I don't know what the situation is, I don't know what the problem is, but I'll get you an update by end of day, get them an update by end of day. Next day, I'll get you a status report by, the day after tomorrow, and I'll put this, and that in it, and then make sure you deliver it. So each time that you have one of those interpersonal transactions, you slowly start to build trust. And in this situation where it's probably already, the temperature's already up, and you're trying to come in and build a working relationship that needs a little bit of trust, set and meet expectations and make sure you meet them. If you say you're going to send a meeting minute, send a meeting minute. So if you're going to call somebody, and even take it the extra step and make the commitment and then meet the commitment over and over. And it creates a cognitive bias where people will start to assume that you're going to live up to your commitments. And that doesn't just apply to the small things. You build that trust with small things, and gradually you can increase the importance of those things, so that in a few weeks' time, when you make a really big ask or you need to do something that requires a lot of trust, you're in a much better position to get that trust and support than you were when you started, or if you really didn't try to build that trust and build that relationship.
Yeah. And sometimes, the solve could be that trust just needs to be built between the team, right? Like if they've had such bad communication, earlier when I dropped off, we talked about how unclear requirements or unclear guidance is so often the cause of broken projects that need to be rescued. That can show up as people just not trusting each other. So I can't believe you sent me this email, or I can't believe you asked for that. Attitudes like that are so difficult to deal with. And since you're coming in with that outside eye, and you're just building small little interactions over your first interactions with them, building some small trust bricks, then you can take that momentum and build it up towards like team members or whole departments finally talking to each other as you go through and solve this work. So building that trust is a really big part of it. And I encourage anybody to watch Kim's TED Talk. He does a great job of expanding on that and making it really easy and to understand how to implement that.
All right, now you've started to build some trust, trying to figure out what's going on, investigating, trying to get a clear picture of what's going on, building your relationship with your stakeholders. At some point, you're going to have to create your 100-day plan. You have to create your plan and your diagnosis of the problem and how you're going to get them out of it.
I think it's really important here when you build that clear picture of what's going on is to just use, what is that, the neutral third party language as often as possible. So if something was late, if Sarah did forget to send out, an invoice and that made something, late and it didn't come through on time, then it's not Sarah sent out, procurement or anything like that late. It's that procurement was delayed. Period. We're not going to have a fun day just throwing people under the bus. That doesn't help anybody. Most people are doing their best at work at any given point. So your clear picture needs to be in that neutral third party language and clearly help people understand where things have broken down. I think that, go ahead.
Yeah, all the English teachers in the room are going to hate when we say that very often passive voice actually works pretty well in this situation. But yeah,
passive voice is critical, in my opinion, in these situations. So, it's so much easier to say, it's like, if somebody broke the dam, right? It's going to be like, much easier to say the dam broke and it caused this amount of damage. There are this many people without homes. There are this many structures that are still working, this many that are not. We estimate we need this amount of funding and this timeline in order to get everybody housed again, in a very, catastrophic example. You really want to paint things unemotionally, paint them with data, paint them with numbers, and don't lean into any sort of blame game. And there could be people in that room that want you to do that. And you can just keep dancing in that third person passive voice by saying, well, that was because the dam broke. Well, who broke the dam? We can talk about that in like a further, what do they call those? Not lessons learned, root cause analysis on exactly what happened with the dam. You can sort of lean on other existing processes so that you don't have to throw anybody under the bus in that meeting. And you can focus just on what the problem is and what's needed to get to whole.
Yeah, and it'll take some time to get there. And I like this other point. You're probably going to be pressed to hurry. Like, hurry up! This is a disaster. It's on fire. Figure it out. Get it going. We've got these deadlines. And yeah, definitely make sure that it's understood that you're proceeding with urgency, but don't rush yourself. You don't want to make the problem worse. So to whatever extent you can, give yourself some time to get things right.
Yeah. And, whenever you're trying to draft this out, if it's a total rehaul, start with your stakeholders. And if it's a chaos mess, start with your team. And what I meant by that was if the original intent of the project needs to be totally and completely rethought, you want to bring that to your stakeholders and have a conversation with them. You want to make sure that everybody is aligned on the definition of success and why you're doing this and what outcomes you want.
Yeah, you've got to basically go back and revalidate the whole concepts of the entire project and make sure that it's still true and that you have an understanding if you're going to try to take it in. I'm sorry, There was a comment there, or somebody was going to speak up.
Oh, I'm not sure. But I will say, if it's a chaos mess, which is that all like success metrics are clear, but the team has somehow just like dropped the ball on the field and is chasing it around and kicking it and never picking the ball back up, then you want to start with your team and understand like what team processes have broken down. Like we knew what we wanted to achieve. Why didn't we start going after it? Like what happened? What's your process? How have you been working together? What was clear? What was unclear? Oh, how do those two teams work together? What are your handoffs? Like, then you want to understand if it's more of an organization and execution problem than it is like an overall goals problem. And so that I feel like there's typically kind of two big categories of problems that show up there. And then you don't want to have your team in the meeting with your stakeholders, because then that's not a safe place for either group of people, right? The stakeholders don't want to look like they don't know how to set direction, and your team doesn't want to look like they don't know how to execute. So when we talk about building that trust and creating an environment that breeds action, that's why you want to think about those groups as separate. And to be clear, you still want to be talking well about both groups to both groups. So letting the stakeholders know that there was some unclear documentation that needs to be clarified is a way to address the chaos mess without saying the team has no idea what they're doing and they can't execute anything. So that's an important part as you think through how you're going to solve that.
Absolutely. And that concept of be careful of your audience. You start with working with people and get your stakeholders alone without the team, and your team alone without the stakeholders, so they're free to speak. You can really understand what's going on. that works the other direction too. So when we get to a point now where we've developed our diagnosis and we are putting together a plan of how we're going to right the ship or reboot this project, once you start to put some shape around what those ideas look like, it's good. And I think this goes back to the comments that came earlier. Don't call everybody into a room and say, this is what we're going to do. That would be a complete disaster. It won't work out well. Instead, and this is relates back to the podcast episode that we had that Kate referred to earlier, is start in small circles. Do it one-on-one. Start with your executive sponsor, and then separately meet with your key stakeholders, separately meet with your technical leads, meet separately with all those people and get their feedback on the plan and on the approach. And then where you feel like you need to start doing some coalition building, maybe you know that your executive sponsor and one of your stakeholders don't get along, don't see eye to eye. It might be a time to get those two people together offline so that you can have just those two together. Because if you can get the key people in the project aligned on the diagnosis, you might have 20 stakeholders and team members involved, but there's probably only 2, 3, 4 that really can make things happen or can obstruct things that need to happen. So start one-on-one with those people, and then where you can and where it makes sense, depending on the criticality of the project, start putting those, instead of one-on-one, two people, 3 people, 4 people, and start building that up so that by the time you do get to that big meeting where you've got to figuratively or literally call everybody into a room and say, here's the problem and here's what we're going to do to solve it, you've already got the buy-in and support of all the key people in the room. And then it's more of a communication effort to get everybody else in the project on board.
Yeah. As you go through this project or this process, I do think that you'll run into pushback. Like there are people who sometimes you'll work with, people on your team who'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. I can't wait to get things unstuck. And then that person will be like the least enthusiastic about getting things unstuck for whatever reason. You're like, how can you be the same person? So sometimes, it's a thing I've reflected on is seeing how some people that show up and are excited you're there actually hate your diagnosis. And some people who think, oh God, another schmuck come to help my project out. Well, go away. Later, they'll become your biggest champion. And like, thank goodness that Kim was here. It was so great to work with somebody who was actually listening to me. And I got to document my plan and work with him in order to bring this broader success to light. So, there could be a variety of responses that may not be the same response people are going to have throughout your entire time working together. But I do think that something here I wanted to bring up was when you have
Internet problems are no fun. Well, hopefully Kate will join us again. But a couple things that to keep in mind as you deliver your diagnosis, even starting with your small one-on-ones, is always try to be respectful and always try to credit the work that came before. Kate, are you back? Oh, thought I heard Kate. But always be respectful of the work that came before you, because before you got on, there's probably a lot of people put blood, sweat, and tears on there. And you're not going to get a lot of fans if you go in and treat it like, well, you guys were a mess and you were a disaster before I showed up. And it's a good thing I'm here because you guys are all losers. You don't want to have that kind of approach to the project. Come in and be respectful. And then hopefully if you've done a good job of building trust and communicating, you can use that to turn things around. When it comes time to deliver the hard news, you've got to be honest. You want to be political, but really you're the one person in the room that should really understand what's going on well enough to pose the hard questions, to really bring the hard news of look, people, this is where you're at. I didn't get you here, but this is where you're at. And this is what it's going to take to get you out of this. Kate, anything to add here?
Can I say something if Kate's not available?
Yeah.
You are 200% correct.
You sound like there's more behind that. Your experience here too with the leveraging the relationships or the crediting.
You're so spot on with the starting from the beginning of having a project not going well and having the, being assigned or voluntold, and then the multiple ways that you can move forward with senior management to make it have a positive outcome for the entire system. When I'm saying system is higher than like one project, but like a whole corporation or healthcare system. You've hit that you hit it nail on the head, and thank you for a really wonderful input on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's tough. And these projects, they can literally be make or break for organizations. And that's why the stakes are so high and why our role can be very important here. And so when you have these conversations with these stakeholders, one thing I would encourage you to consider when you present options is do just that, present options. And so you can say, look, here's where we're at. You financially, from a scope perspective, schedule perspective, all the hard news. And then when you talk about the plan going forward, recognize that you are the doctor and it's your job to provide treatment options. So you can say, okay, some option is we can change the scope and still get it done something close to budget, something close to schedule. That another option might be, look, if you want to get where you originally wanted to, you still can, but it's going to cost you so much more money. Or, you know what, at this stage, you may be best firing your supplier and starting over with a new one, but here's what that's going to cost. And here's the legal trouble that might follow. So your job as a project manager is to inform the decision makers so they can make the best possible decision in this terrible situation. And so to whatever extent you can, break out your options, understand the benefits, understand the drawbacks, and understand there's probably not going to be any good option here. And one other thing I will say is you should almost always have an option that says, kill the project. Because that is always something that should be considered. There is a lot of sunk cost, and there's the whole sunk cost fallacy to consider, and maybe even call that out. But any project at some stage is going to come to a point where you can say, this is untenable. We're better off just killing this. And it's not your call to make that decision, but it's the sponsors and stakeholders. They need to be able to consider that. And very often you'll bring that up and they'll say, no, we absolutely can't do that. We absolutely have it. And that even works for you as well, because now you're saying, okay, well, why is that? Help me understand why you think that is such a non-option. And that helps you understand and help communicate better what are the things that are making them want to stick with this tough project, and how far are they willing to go there.
And you're spot on. It really becomes providing the information for C-level management, to providing them the information to make an informed decision on how to move forward. Because it really is the project manager giving information to senior leadership, director, VP, or C-level or president level management to make an informed decision.
100%.
What do you think about that?
I think that is absolutely right on.
So Joe, you make a really good point. I think in your comment before this one, that being honest and exposing what's going on really will help the organization to not repeat the same situation. I mean, and that's when you're moving into a failed project, it's not just the responsibility of recovering the project if it's tenable, but helping the organization understand how they got there and not creating that same situation.
Margaret, you are 250% spot on. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. And I guess through all this, I want to call out one thing that I learned from Kate. Kate's a fan of this book called Crucial Conversations. And if you haven't read that book, go read the book today. Or you can we've got 3 episodes of the podcast that we talked about this one. You can listen to that for the short version, but I still recommend that you buy the book. And one of the great things that I learned from Kate, through Kate, that came from that book was really this idea of get curious, and you'll run into problems, you'll run into challenges, there'll be high emotions, and try not to have that gut reaction we always have, is to fight into it or to cower and just shut down and be quiet. But when the emotions start to rise, keep calm and hopefully they'll mirror that, but be curious. Okay, I understand that shutting down the project is really not an option for you. And they're maybe getting upset about it. Say, okay, can you talk about that? I'd really want to understand, this project seems really important to you. Can you talk about that? Help us understand why this is so important so we can have the same appreciation of that as you and really do that. And of course, in my 30 seconds, I cannot possibly capture all the gold nuggets that are in that book, but so go out and get yourself a copy of Crucial Conversations.
That's awesome. Can you send me more information about that so I can send it out to PMI Maine, which is like almost going to like 500 people?
I will be
And,
happy to. Yeah, I'll get you a link to it on Amazon. Does that work?
Thank you.
Yeah.
That absolutely works 100%. It's going to add significant value to PMI Maine. And we really appreciate you offering that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Kate, I think you're back now.
What a journey.
We're done.
You did such a good job. Way to go, Kim. You carried today.
I was just talking you up and talking up Crucial Conversations and how that could really be useful at this point in the dialogue when you start to give your kind of solution or your diagnosis and the emotions may run high.
Yeah, emotions are high, stakes are high, and stakes are tough and emotions are high. I forget their slogan, but yeah, a career-changing book for me, Crucial Conversations.
All right. And that's it. It's that easy to be the wolf.
Well, I so thank you for this. This has been a wonderful, wonderful event. You provided amazing information, and PMI Maine, thank you so much for this information. And if any of the members have questions, please send them to me or any of the board members, and we'll consolidate that and we'll get back to the speakers. But
yeah,
this has been a great event.
If we've got,
it's great. It was thought provoking. Thank you.
Yeah, if we've got time, we can answer more questions, or I don't know where we are on time actually. So
yeah, it looks like we have about 15 minutes left. We typically go for about an hour presentation and then leave some time at the end for networking.
All right. Well, we're happy to do any more questions.
Yeah.
Kate's great at the question bit. So if you want to
give me your questions.
Yeah.
I'm curious. You mentioned, make sure you find your allies within this particular environment. I'm curious if each of you had individual experiences where you've had to also identify your adversaries very clearly and how you mitigate that. I'm very curious about any strategies you have and you mentioned a couple, but I'm just curious about what you think is your best approach to mitigating that adversarial relationship that you may or may not encounter within this context.
I would try to build trust with them the same way you would try to build it with the people who are your allies. It may or may not work, but I'd say do what you can. But Kate's
I've dealt with some terrible adversaries. I think the gender comes into this, and I'm pretty loud about that. But man, I've had some people who did not like me. So I've had adversaries that I could not overcome. And so if they are good at their job, but they just don't like you, you want to understand what they need in order to be happy. And happy here, I'm using like, what do they need in order to get what they need out of you so you can limit your interaction? So what can you provide? What makes them happy? That's the word I would use.
It's good.
If you have people that are like out to get you, which sucks, I've had that. You want to find your allies and basically move away from roles where you interact with that person, which is frustrating. But I'm of the opinion that like, if you're a strong person and then they're strong, or for whatever reason, hold a grudge, like, I don't know, it's oil and water. Like there's nothing to mix those two things together. So, ally with your champions. I had somebody that was terrible to me for 2 long years. And I moved out of that org. I had other people I leaned on during that time. I limited my contact with that person. So that's a way to work through that. Yeah, you'll know who your adversaries are. There's no, who they are. No tips on identifying them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you
That's,
say, Kate, that you can also use those allies and those champions to understand how to deal with the adversaries? Because if you have an ally and they're a partner, they might have the same relationship, and they might be able to help you deal with that person who is not supporting you.
Yeah, I currently have somebody that I wouldn't say is, and that's great advice. I currently have somebody that I wouldn't say is an adversary, but I have responsibility for 2 domains and he wants one of my domains. And I'm like, but it's mine. It's my job. And one of the things that I'm actually doing is letting go of that belief, trusting my leadership that I have enough to do in the other domain that I spend 80% of my time in anyways, and working with that. An adversary would be a strong word for this person, but somebody who like I have a competing objective against, and trying to clearly identify like roles and responsibilities and get that out as clear as we can. Because I think we both do want the best thing for the company. Ugh, we hate those words, but it's true. Like if you're both invested in what's great for the company, then you can use those words to have those types of tough conversations, which are, again, words I didn't think I'd say at any time in my career.
Both excellent points, Margaret. Thank you for your input, and you have amazing value to add to all this. So thank you for your contributions and then conversations. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe.
It looks
Evan?
like Evan has his hand up.
Evan has his hand up, so we want to talk with Evan.
Hey, Evan.
Yeah, thanks guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's very informative. Really enjoyed it. So one thing that I've come across, and it's sort of like an unofficial adage that, you know, a very skilled project manager doesn't need actual technical knowledge of the project that's being executed. You know, like I liken this to certain IT domains. When you have a project that you have to be the wolf on, are you expecting some level of technical knowledge, or if not, how do you leverage your SMEs, you know, exactly to bridge that gap?
So yes and no. So it's not your job to be the technical SME. It's your job to be the expert on how to deliver that project. And you can't deliver a project if you don't know what the hell is going on. And so you need some level of command of the subject matter. You need to understand, where can it go wrong? Where does it usually go wrong? What do we do about it? So I've had this conversation many times over the years. And I think that project managers shouldn't try to be a technical expert, but they should try to be an expert in how that technology is implemented. And they have to do that. They have to have a command of the technology. And so what I do is, when I've got a new technology in a project that I'm doing, I will literally take the subject matter experts and block them in a room with me with a whiteboard marker. And I'll say, draw me a picture. Tell me how this thing works. Tell me what we're doing. Tell me what does it look like today? What's it going to look like in the future? And what's the transition state between now and then? And then once they explain that, and I've asked literally 100 questions sometimes, and they start to get an understanding of it, then I'll say, okay, where does this break? And have them take me through all that. So I think that's totally within your rights as a project manager to learn that, but don't go out and become a CCNA. You don't have to go to that level, but you should understand what are the parts and how do they fit together and how do they break and what's it going to take to implement it.
Yeah.
So on that, sorry, Kate.
Oh, the only thing I'd add to that is if nobody wants to step up into that SME role, right? Because you should lean on them and trust them. You know, if nobody wants to be the architect, that's a gap that you should identify, right? If there's nobody who's going to say, I'm the SME,
Right.
you can count on me for this, right? And that would go and present that future architecture to, you know, whatever stakeholders, then that's the gap. Or there's somebody that doesn't want to do that. And then you're working with them and you're trusting them. I think the approach I take is, there's a woman I worked with she's the wolf all the time. She's phenomenal. And what she would do would say, well, you told me that was your plan. Why didn't your plan work? Like she just straight up does that. And I adore her. So I think you're looking for ownership and accountability as well, and all that stuff that Kim said. But Margaret, please go ahead, chime in.
I was going to say, if you engage those subject matter experts to explain their world, then you're gaining allies.
That is so true. They don't, a lot of times we think that technical people are not going to respect us if we're not experts. Really, it's if you would respect what they're doing and ask those questions, you're so exactly right. You will start to get their respect and you'll gain them as allies.
Right, and they have bosses, right? So the subject matter experts have a chain of command, and if you start to engage them and respect their knowledge and their work, then you might gain some credibility up the chain.
Absolutely.
You're so spot on, Margaret. Thank you.
What other questions have we got? I can actually share, so the two disaster projects I talked about, there was the one with the 1,500 line project plan, and there was the one that I had to hop on the plane for the UK for. The one in the UK, once we had identified the gap, which was that we had huge gaps in our understanding of dependencies, we spent about a week sorting that out. And by the end of the week, we had things starting to move ahead again. And within 2 or 3 months, the project was back on track and we delivered. And we lost a boatload of money from a profitability perspective, but we got the project done. The customer retracted their letter and they were still referenceable at the end of that. But they don't always go that well. The other project I mentioned with the 1,500 line project plan, after seeing what was going on and understanding they had gone through to a whole new set of stakeholders and they basically needed to stop and change their scope. On my professional services team that I worked with, the organization wouldn't accept that. I said, you can't do this as a fixed fee. You need to switch it to T&M, take a hit on it, just realign, rebaseline, because you're never going to get this done anywhere near what you thought you're going to. You need to change the terms. You need to restart the contract and renegotiate it. And they refused to listen to me. And we were talking about people who are not your friends. They actually had a PM on their side who was literally an abusive personality. And the fact that my team wouldn't take my advice, and the fact that their project manager was literally abusive, and I could not find any tools to manage them. At the end of it, I gave my advice and they wouldn't listen to it. And I said, okay, well, I'm not going to deliver this. I can't, I'm not equipped to do this. So I had to drop out of the project. And I hate to say I told you so, but I did. And the project took an extra year to do. It was supposed to be done in 6 months. It took a year longer, and it cost the company literally millions of dollars because they didn't want to stop and reassess and reset. So sometimes as a doctor, people don't take your diagnosis.
So as the doctor, how did that feel? I mean, that was a decision point for you in your career if you're assigned to that, and that's what you're working on.
It was hard. It was the first time in my career I ever came across a project that I couldn't sort out and get figured out. So that was my moment when I realized I'm not the patient, I'm the doctor, and I can do everything I can to provide good, clear, professional advice. But ultimately, it's not my project. I didn't own the P&L of the services company. I wasn't the customer. And I had to offer my advice and do the best job I possibly could. And
yeah, we have an episode on imposter syndrome that I feel like maybe was what Kim would have gone through after that talks about like how to check your sanity as something like that happens.
Yeah. So did you succeed or did you fail in that? That's a big decision, Kim.
I had a conversation with the executives on my services company, and I said, look, guys, the worst part was they all agreed to my approach, and they had an executive call just before my status meeting. And so I was sitting in the customer site in the conference room, waiting for the customers, stakeholders and executives to come in, realign with our new approach. And they came in, and my sponsor was on the phone, and they said, no, actually, we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with the current plan. We're not going to change. And so he completely changed direction on me. And then I sat there for 20 minutes as their abusive project manager berated me personally. And I said, nah, I don't think so. I'm not doing this.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Understand.
So not always a happy ending, but
there's more work to be done. So that's okay.
There are a lot of projects out there that will take my advice, and I'm happy to work with them.
There you go.
Any other questions?
Doesn't look like any more in the chat. Do we have any more from the audience here?
Yeah, I got one more. I'm fascinated by the idea of how much do financials play into this process? I mean, you know, some of us work for private companies, some work for smaller companies, some of us work for larger publicly traded companies. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the impact of financials as far as it goes in terms of unscrewing a project, you know, fixing a project. And in your experience, have you found that the financials actually get in the way of a solution at times, or have you found that you've basically gotten the financial support that you've needed to fix the issue?
That
Great.
depends on
Go.
the project. Yeah,
Yeah.
it really does.
Yeah.
So I think I've worked for companies where like if you work on internal projects, they're like, it doesn't matter, like who cares, which is kind of wild. I've worked on internal projects where they're like, I can't believe we've wasted so much money and time. But I will say that I think everything is financially driven, and it's about learning the financial decision making of the org that you're working with. Yeah, Margaret's saying I think it depends on the sponsor, and I agree. It's very cultural, and it's even you know, right now we're apparently headed into a recession, right? And so that's also going to change the makeup of how we make decisions around projects. So it is
Sure.
always related to finances, but I found it specific to you know, a small company spending $250K, that might be their entire budget for the year. A giant publicly, like Meta, spending $250K is absolutely nothing, and they may not
Right.
even bat an eye at another 500 grand. But you know, PMI Maine would bat many eyes at 500 grand. So like that culture is very different to consider in each environment you're in.
Yeah.
Sure.
I
Thank
would
you.
offer, I'd actually offer up that the greater the financial scrutiny, the greater your chances are of success. Because if you're in an organization and you've got a project that's on the skids, it's a wreck, and it's going to take forever. It's going to take all kinds of resources to turn it around. If the organization doesn't understand financials, if they don't really track it at the project level, and you know, they don't have scrutiny on how they spend their money, it's hard to use that stick to get them to turn around. Sometimes though, if they've got more scrutiny on the financials, you can say, hey, look, right now you've got justified this much budget, and here's what it's actually going to take. So what do we want to do about it? And that can have enough attention that drives some urgency. Not always, but more often than not.
No, that's great. Thanks. I apologize if that seemed like the obvious question, but I'm just curious about the impact of that. So thanks for that. It's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah. I agree with all the above. I've worked with military, I've worked with financial, I've worked with healthcare,
Mhm.
I've worked with retail, and
Mhm.
and I've worked with healthcare nonprofit, and the duration across all of them seemed to be the same,
Mm.
but the amount of money to be spent was drastically different.
Right.
If you went to like financial / insurance,
Mhm.
money is not that big of a difference. You just have to give a solid date when you are going to complete your project. That is
Mhm.
the big thing, because they have more money than God. I'm just being blunt. Okay.
Yeah.
If you want to
Right.
go to the other extreme, healthcare. My experience with healthcare is really limited to Maine Health, and you know, the money there is huge. It's not duration, it's really how much you're going to spend.
Yeah.
Right.
And
They're yeah, definitely interested in different parameters. That's for sure.
yeah, and then if you want to go middle ground, it's manufacturing. And I've worked for manufacturing, for straight manufacturing, and the manufacturing was for United Technologies, and they had two streams. They had one stream that was for, you know, building fuel injections for Mack trucks, which, you know, it's in between, you know, the financial institutions, you know, that had more money than God, and then healthcare. And then there was the military component of manufacturing, and that was an open checkbook. If you just promised them a better solution, you could go. It was time bound, but you could go, you know, 7-8 figures, and they would go for that. But if you didn't make that on on the 2 or 3 year horizon, you were nailed. So it really, in my humble experiences from being through all those things, it's by industry. In the industry I don't have experiences is with state government, but I have talked with officials from, the head of the PMO for all of Maine. In Maine, the way it works is you have your top level, and then you have a PMO manager for DMV, for family care, et cetera, and it all varies from there. And it's kind of closer to healthcare, where there is a very slim margin in money. So I just give a great answer, but it really depends by industry in my past, 40 years experience of being in multiple industries. Questions, concerns, what I just said?
That's great perspective, Joe. Thanks. I appreciate that very much. It's an interesting, it's a great way to look at it, across those different contexts.
Yeah, so I think we're at time. So I will thank everybody so much for their time and great questions and feedback. It's been a lot of fun. Kate and I love to connect. So the QR code's on your screen. We'll let you connect to us directly, or you can find us on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
I highly encourage you to listen to Kate and Kim's podcast. I have listened to many episodes, and they are great ways to do a couple loads of laundry and throw your earpods in and or AirPods and listen away. So
Right.
very, very great presentation. Thank you so much, Kate and Kim, for taking time out of your afternoon into your evening and spending time with PMI Maine.